There's actually a Supreme Court order of 2013 which just says the same thing. It demands that the government assess the conservation status of all species of flora and fauna on a periodic 3-year basis and bring it in tune with the IUCN Red List. Now, this is not merely a paper book exercise. It is going to require active field work, pooling together of data right across or the entire geography of India and using systematic scientific methods. So every 3-year cycle, the data is comparable. And this order was passed April 2013, and we are in the early days of 22, nearly 10 years down the line, and MOEF hasn't really acted on it. And this process of amendment that's going on is a good opportunity to inculcate and actually implement a standing order of the Supreme Court. The other thing I think the Act misses completely is it talks about species, but habitats and landscapes can also be endangered. And it doesn't really give us scope to recognize and accord extra protection to them. Connectivity, for instance, is not even mentioned really. There is case law on corridors, but we don't see enough emphasis being actually placed in the amendment that we are currently seeing. And it's very terrestrial focused, both in terms of the provisions of the various sections and in terms of the listing of the schedules. And some species like vultures are not going to recognize any boundaries. The scale at which they operate is going to be so huge. So, and vultures are among the most endangered species that India is currently dealing with. So, these are all things that I think we need to find a way to communicate to the Parliamentary Standing Committee.
It seems odd to me, but the things that you've just mentioned actually find mentioned in the National Wildlife Action Plan 2017-2031, and this amendment seems to even ignore that. Basically, it's this government's the National Wildlife Action Plan 2017 was drafted by the MOEFCC recently. The Act seems to not even speak to that, because if you look at the objectives of that, they have things like just looking through the headings in the National Wildlife Action Plan, we have a very detailed plan actually, which incorporates things like conservation of threatened species, strengthening and improving protected area network, landscape level approach for wildlife conservation, integrating climate change in wildlife planning, people's participation in wildlife planning, conservation awareness and outreach, wildlife health management, conservation of threatened species, mitigation of human wildlife conflict, conservation of inland aquatic systems, conservation of coastal and marine systems, and so on and so forth. And it has a component on strengthening research and monitoring in India and integrating the National Wildlife Action Plan with other sectoral programs. Now, all of these amendments are silent on, which is unfortunate. I think it is a real missed opportunity to have, to have taken a step back, looked at the Act, broadened the stakeholder engagement across. They could have taken a year to really examine all the different aspects of the Act and seen how to reformulate it better and make it, like you said, make it relevant for the next 10 years, 20 years, or even 50 years. And I think the Act, there's a missed opportunity on this. I think the small scale tinkering which this current amendment does is not sufficient. As Iravati said, there's no basis, no scientific basis for listing a species in one schedule or the other. In fact, they have removed several schedules and clubbed everything into 2 schedules. They have effectively then criminalized the eradication of pest species, including rodents and all sorts of stuff which are problematic. And that they will be declared vermin on a case-by-case basis upon notification. It also, I think, problematically puts too much power in the central authority, in the center, rather than in the states. So a lot of in the earlier version or in the current version of the Act, the chief wildlife warden of the state holds a lot of power and authority. But in this version, more power is being centralized, and I think this is not a welcome step. In fact, Ravi, would you like to mention about some of the provisions of the FRA and um, some of the provisions of the FRA and how they could be used to strengthen the Act itself?
Well, to me, a step in the right direction is actually the mentioning of the FRA in the proposed amendment. But again, it's a missed opportunity because it is not mentioned in a positive, proactive way as to how we can synergize the enabling provisions of FRA, make sure that FRA is implemented in real spirit in which that legislation was passed, so that you bring people on board as partners, empowering them, giving them rights, and that they become custodians of local biodiversity. This whole attitude towards people needs to change. It needs to be looking at them as partners. And in the current existing Wildlife Protection Act, there is a provision for local sanctuary and advisory committees. And unfortunately, not a single committee has been set up. These are all important provisions to engage local communities, bring them on board, make them partners in the process. And subsequent to that provision is, of course, the enactment of FRA. FRA has the critical wildlife habitat provision, which the onus is on MOEF to establish critical wildlife habitat. Again, a lost opportunity in 15 years, not even a single critical wildlife habitat has been established. So I think this thinking, you did mention about alignment across relevant and intersecting laws. That process has to be driven not by a particular ministry, maybe by the Prime Minister's office or Niti Aayog or the law ministry has to do this, because if it is taken up by a particular sectoral ministry, they tend to probably take more ownership for the laws that they have enacted and not pay due attention to legislations of other ministries.